Today's reading, this morning's reading, is from Exodus 6, which can be found on page 62 in the church Bibles. So that's Exodus 6, starting at verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of his country." God also said to Moses, "I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty. But by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, where they resided as foreigners. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant. Therefore, say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord." Moses reported this to the Israelites, but they did not listen to him because of their discouragement and harsh labor. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the Israelites go out of his country." But Moses said to the Lord, "If the Israelites will not listen to me, why would Pharaoh listen to me, since I speak with faltering lips?"
Thank you very much, Simeon, for that reading. It'd be great if you can keep Exodus 6 open in front of you. We're going to spend a little while looking at it together. While we were singing then, you just had this little handout brought round to you. This isn't a handout for this sermon particularly. It's just a background handout for the whole series that we're doing as we go through the whole of the Bible story in about 10 or 11 weeks. So somebody said to me it would just be useful to have all of it on one piece of paper. So on one side you've got the basic sort of chronology, the key people, and then on the other side you can see the themes that we're tracking through the whole of this story and how they fit together and center on Jesus. A reminder to parents that the children and young people are also going through very similar material, so do jot down things that you're learning and talk about them with your kids over lunch. Somebody, actually one of the kids said to their mum after the first week, I think, they were so excited by all they'd learned, they weren't sure how they'd cope with waiting 7 days to get the next installment. So isn't that great, that hunger to learn? Well, in the summer, we had the opportunity to visit the city of Nantes on the northwest coast of France. It's a lovely city, but like a number of British cities, it has quite a dark past. In the 18th century, Nantes gained huge wealth on the back of involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. In fact, about 500,000 African slaves were transported through Nantes to be sold into slavery in the New World. And rather than kind of try and airbrush this out of the city's history, the city officials have decided it's better to acknowledge what happened. So they've got this memorial to the abolition of the slave trade on the banks of the huge river Loire in the middle of the city. And we had a chance to walk through it. There was a quote there from Nelson Mandela which caught my eye. He said this. He said, "I am not truly free if I am taking away someone else's freedom, just as surely as I am not free when my freedom is taken from me. The oppressed and oppressor alike are robbed of their humanity." It's a very striking, perceptive quote, I think, about the nature of freedom. It's obvious that the slaves had their freedom taken from them. But the point that Mandela is making is that in oppressing those slaves, the oppressors allowed themselves to be robbed of their true humanity. And in that sense, they too lost authentic freedom. The point is that freedom isn't just the absence of restraint. Freedom is about who we are. Freedom is not just about freedom from something, somebody else controlling us. It's also freedom for something. Freedom to be authentically human. And if there is a God, and I'm convinced that there is a God, I think life makes more sense with God in the picture. If there is a God, then freedom to be authentically human must, I think, be freedom to be who He created us to be. And that, of course, is where our whole Bible story began, with the story of creation and God creating us for freedom. Freedom to know Him, freedom to know others, freedom to know ourselves, freedom to be in tune with our world. That is the freedom that God created us for. But as we saw in the second week of the story, that is also the freedom that we lost as human beings in what we've called de-creation. That moment when we turned our backs on God and put ourselves in His place. But God made us, and therefore God loves us. And the freedom for which He made us is the freedom that He still desires for us. And so the Bible story is the story of what He has done to make that freedom possible for us, to recreate that freedom for us. And I'm persuaded that the news of that recreating work of God is the best news that humankind has ever heard. If you're not convinced yet, that's fine. It's brilliant that you're here as part of the journey to explore it for yourself. And my hope and prayer is that as we go through the story, you'll see how it makes sense within itself, how it makes sense of our human experience, and how it offers to each of us the hope that each of us, I think, is looking to find. Last week we were introduced to the three strands of that story, which will weave their way through the whole of the Bible. God's people, God's blessing, God's place. God's people, a nation, initially Israel, called into relationship with God. That relationship being a relationship of blessing, where God recreates something for them of what He created them for in the first place. Right relationships with Him, with each other, with the world, with themselves. And that blessing being something that they were to share with all of the nations. And then finally, the gift of the land, the place where they would live with God in His presence. God's people, God's blessing, and God's place. And we're going to just look at each of those this morning in the next stage of the story. Let me just warn you, the first one, I'm going to tell more of the actual narrative, so it will take longer. So don't be discouraged if we're still on the first one in a few minutes' time. Let's look at the first one, God's people, the nation set free, and let's see how that happens. Last week we were focusing in on one particular character, on Abraham and his wife Sarah. And we saw how God made these amazing promises to them of a great offspring that would bring blessing to the nations. Well, in the end, old and childless Abraham and Sarah had their promised son. His name was Isaac. He married Rebekah, and they had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob went on to have 12 sons, and those sons were the kind of founding fathers of the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. One of Jacob's sons had a musical written about him. His name was Joseph. And as you perhaps know, Joseph was cruelly sold into Egypt by his brothers. Well, the story goes on that Joseph in a single day went from prisoner to prime minister, and then went on to lead the nation of Egypt through 7 years of desperate famine. But the story doesn't finish there, because the famine didn't only affect Egypt, it affected the whole of the region. So Joseph's family, back in their promised land of Canaan, they too were hungry, and decided eventually in their desperation to go to Egypt, where they'd heard there was food. And there they were reunited with Joseph. the brother who had been sold into slavery. And Joseph forgave them for what they had done. And he looked after them. And the family settled there in the lands of Egypt. And in fact, they thrived in the land of Egypt. They thrived to a point where they began to be perceived as a threat by the Egyptian community and by their king, the Pharaoh, because they were becoming so numerous. And the book of Exodus tells us the story of what happened, how the Egyptian Pharaoh, because he felt threatened by this rapidly growing community, decided to oppress them as slaves. The book of Exodus tells that story. But God then called one of those Israelites. His name was Moses. And he called him to go to the Pharaoh and to tell the Pharaoh that he must set the Israelites free from their slavery. And so very reluctantly, that's what Moses did. He went to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go. The God of Israel has said, let them go so that they can go and worship me in the deserts." Do you think Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, would listen to an instruction from the God of Israel? Hardly. Not at all. In fact, what happened was that Pharaoh made the situation even worse and oppressed the slaves, the Israelite slaves, even more bitterly, which made things very difficult for the Israelites. But it also put Moses into a tight corner because he had gone to set the people free, but instead of setting them free, he had made their situation a whole lot worse. That's what brings us to Exodus 6 and the passage that we read together. Have a look at verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, after all this had happened, "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let the people go. Because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of his country." But then look at verses 2 to 5, and you'll see here lots of echoes of the things that we looked at last week. Verse 2, God also said to Moses, "I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham," remember him, "to Isaac his son, to Jacob his son, as God Almighty, but by my name, the Lord," that's the name Yahweh, the God of Israel's special name, "by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them." Do you remember we saw about the making of the covenant last week? The cutting up of the animals, God walking down between them, saying he would take responsibility to keep this covenant, this special relationship with them. That's here too. "I made my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, where they resided as foreigners. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant," which doesn't mean that God had forgotten what he had promised to do. What it means is he's decided now he's going to act and fulfill that promise. So how is God going to do it? How is God going to set the people free from their slavery? Verse 6. "Say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment." Somebody sent me this little clip in the week. Isn't it funny how red, white, and blue represent freedom unless they're flashing behind you? The might of the law, on the one hand, protecting the freedom of one group of people, but bringing punishment to the other. Freedom, it rather depends on your perspective, doesn't it? And here as well, it's going to be the same in Egypt, because God is going to bring judgment on Egypt for its oppression. But through that act of judgment, he is going to bring freedom, liberty, to the Israelite community. Judgment and redemption will go together. What does redemption mean? What is God redeeming? Well, redeeming is about buying something back. So God is going to set Israel free from their slavery in Egypt by paying a price that will bring them out of slavery into relationship with himself. He's going to buy them back for himself. He's going to redeem them. Well, That's what happened. Moses repeatedly went to Pharaoh, demanding Israel's freedom. And Pharaoh kept on resisting time after time. But each time he resisted, God sent plagues of judgment on Egypt in response. There were frogs, there were locusts, there were skin diseases, there were all kinds of troubles. And as you go through the story, the plagues escalate. They seem to get worse and worse. But as the plagues get worse and worse, Pharaoh's heart gets more and more resistant to God's voice, until eventually God warns of the final, most devastating of plagues. God says that the angel of death is going to pass through the lands of Egypt, and the firstborn child of every household will die. Devastating response in judgment of Egypt for the way that they are oppressing the people. The devastating blow. But there was a problem with it. If the angel of death was going to move through Egypt and strike the firstborn of each household to be dead, how are the Israelite families and households going to be protected? Well, the answer comes in Exodus chapter 12. You don't have to turn to it. I'll put it up on the screen there in a second. What's going to happen? Well, each Israelite is to take a lamb and slaughter the lamb, and before they eat it together, they're to take some of the blood and wipe it around the door frames of their houses, so that when the angel of death passes through Egypt, it will see the blood on the doorposts and will pass over the Israelite houses, and the judgment will not fall on them. Exodus 12 and 13, on that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. This, of course, is the origins of the Jewish feast of the Passover, because the angel of death passed over the Israelite households. Well, as a result of this devastating plague, Pharaoh finally caves in and allows the Israelites to leave their slavery in Egypt. But before we move on, we must pause, because this is a hugely important moment in the Bible's story. What's happened here? Well, the Passover lamb has died in order that the Israelites might live. And that principle of substitution is one that we'll see all the way through the Bible. One that we'll see time and again. The Passover lamb died as their substitute, paying the price to set them free from death and from slavery. It is only a very, very small step from there into the New Testament, which tells us that the death of Jesus took place at the time of the Passover, because he was the true Passover lamb who died as our substitute, his blood shielding us from the judgment of God, which all of us deserve for the bad stuff in our lives. He died to pay the price of our freedom. And all of a sudden we realize this isn't just an ancient story of historical interest. This can be our story too. Because don't we need setting free? Isn't there stuff in our hearts that we struggle to break free from? Don't we wonder what comes beyond death, and if we do have to face a God of judgment, how's it going to be? Here is the answer. That God would send his son Jesus to die for us, to take the punishment we deserved, so that we could be free from judgment and free to know and love God and live in his presence. Let me tell you about Johnny. Johnny was an eccentric little boy who liked to make models. And one day, Johnny bought a model kit to make a beautiful sailing boat that he liked to take to the park and sail on he hoped he would sail on the lake there. So Johnny made his boat. He was so proud of it, and he took it off and he began to sail it. And it was quite a windy day, and the boat went like a dream. But unfortunately, the wind was a bit too strong that day, and the boat sailed rather too quickly. And very soon it was out of Johnny's reach, and eventually it was out of his sight. And Johnny had lost his treasured boat. He was sad. But a week or two later, he went to a shop in town, one of his favorite shops, where they sold model toy boats of this kind. And there in the window, he saw this beautiful boat, and he looked at it and he said, "That's my boat. That's my boat." So he went inside and he spoke to the shopkeeper and said, "Sir, you've got my boat in your window. Can I have it, please?" And the shopkeeper said, "Well, it's £50. If you pay £50, you can have it." So Johnny scratched his head and dug deep and went home and appealed to the bank of mum and dad and came back with his £50, and he bought his boat back. He was a slightly eccentric lad, and as he walked down the streets with his boat under his arm, he talked to his boat. I mean, this is a made-up story, but imagine. And he said, "I'm so pleased to have you. Do you know," he says, "you're mine twice now. You're mine because I made you, and you're mine because I bought you back." It's what God says to each of us who have been rescued through the death of a substitute who died in our place. We're his because he made us. He has rights over us, but we're his also because in great love he brought us back to himself. We're his twice. Isn't that great news? Isn't that a secure place to stand? A great way to live your life. God's people set free by God's actions. But God doesn't just set us free from something. He sets us free for something as well. And we're going to look at a couple of dimensions of that briefly. We're set free from our slavery, but we're set free to live in God's way. This is about God's blessing. Over this last week, as you've already heard, we've had some great evenings here where we've heard the stories of different people encountering Jesus in their lives. And one of my favorite moments was when the footballer Limvoy Primus was talking about how liberating it was for him to discover that he could play his football for Jesus. And he said, "It didn't make me play any less hard, but it meant I could start enjoying it because it was no longer just about me. It was for him." And that set him free. And I loved it. Did you know you could play football for Jesus? Just like you can be an accountant for Jesus, or a doctor, or a teacher, or a marketing person, or a software engineer. You can do it for Jesus because all of life is to be lived for him and with him. See, living God's way isn't just about narrowing us down into grey kind of people who are only interested in religion and church. No, living God's way is about having the whole of life filled with meaning and significance and joy as we live it for God. Because we're beginning to live life in the way it was meant to be lived. We're set free from slavery, but we're set free to live. Well, let's go back to Exodus chapter 6 and verse 7. Where we read this: God says to Moses and to Israel, "I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians." In other words, God is saying, I'm going to take you into this special relationship with myself, in which I'm going to bless you, in which I'm going to give you your life back, in which I'm going to bring you into a right relationship with me and with others, with your environment, even with yourself. I'm going to bless you. And then in Exodus 19 to 24, when the people reach Mount Sinai, all of the detail of what that means starts to get unpacked for them. At the heart of this is what we call the Ten Commandments, at the heart of the ancient Jewish law. Probably the most familiar part of the book of Exodus to many of them. Let me just say 5 quick things about the Ten Commandments, which are a summary of how to live life in God's way. Number 1, obeying the law didn't make Israel into the people of God. No, it was a response to them being God's people already. Notice in Exodus 20, the first verse of that chapter. Before any of the commandments, we read this: God spoke all of these words, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. That's before a single command has been given. God says, I am already your God. I've already rescued you to be my people. So we mustn't read the Ten Commandments as if they are a series of steps we're meant to climb, and if we get to the top, God will say, okay, you're good enough, you can belong to me. It's not how it works. No, the deal is, through what God does, we belong to him. He rescues us, brings us to himself, and then he teaches us how to live in his way in response to that. Obeying the law didn't make Israel God's people. Number 2, the law covers all of life. We often think, don't we, that the really important bits that God has to say to us is about how we relate to one another. And the Ten Commandments come to mind with the talk of making sure that we don't murder or lie or steal or commit adultery. And those are the really important bits of the Ten Commandments, we say. And, oh yes, how we relate to God, well, that's just a matter of personal preference, isn't it? Because there are lots of different ways after all. I mean, surely God's not fussy. He won't mind. Well, the really interesting thing is that the Ten Commandments aren't like that at all. See, if God is there, then by far the most important thing we've got to figure out is how we relate to him. That must come first because he's our creator. And that's what's most important. And so that's where the Ten Commandments begin. Not with how to be better people to each other, but with how to relate to God. The first 4 commandments are all about our relationship with God. And only then do we come on to the last 6 to do with how we relate to each other. The law covers all of life. And then the law isn't just about our behavior, it's about our hearts too. It finishes with this most challenging of commands. Verse 17, you shall not covet or you shall not desire your neighbor's house or your neighbor's wife or his male or female servant or ox or donkey or anything else that belongs to him. The New Testament develops this a whole lot further, but it's there right at the beginning. It's so challenging. It isn't just about our behavior. It's about the inside as well. It's about what we desire. Goodness, that's hard. So when people say, oh, yes, I try and live by the Ten Commandments, what they normally mean is that they have a go at living by maybe 5 of the 10. And the rest, haven't really noticed, are there. But when we see all of the Ten Commandments together, we realize that yes, this is a great way to live, but this is a dead-end route to God. Because we're never going to be able to climb the ladder and live this way. We just can't do it. We need a rescuer, not just some laws. Number 4, the law is given to enrich us, not to spoil our fun. Remember, this is about being blessed. It's about having life recreated to be what it was meant to be. Look, life is better without adultery, without theft, without lies, without jealousy, without murder. God isn't trying to spoil our fun. He's trying to protect us. And life is better when human beings know that they're accountable to a God to whom they must answer. Life is better that way. The law isn't to spoil our fun. It's to bless us and enrich our lives. And then fifthly, God gave Israel the law not just to bless them, but to make them a blessing to the nations. They were to pass it on. We don't have time to open that up just now. So let's summarize. We've got a nation set free, God's people. We've got them set free to live God's way, live within his blessing. Finally, and just briefly, freedom to know God's presence. Because when you love someone, you want to be with them, don't you? And God loves his people and calls us to love him, and therefore he wants us to live in his presence. And that's really what the rest of the book of Exodus is all about, where God moves in among his people. Chapters 1 to 18, God is rescuing them. Chapters 19 to 24, God is marrying them, really, teaching them what it means to live with him. And then chapters 25 to 40, God moves in. He brings his presence among them. Exodus 25, verses 8 and 9. Let them make a sanctuary, a holy place for me, and I will dwell among them. I will live among them. Make this tabernacle, that's what the sanctuary was called, and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you. The tabernacle was a kind of temple that was constructed as a tent because they were a nomadic community still moving around. But the key thing is it's where God lived among his people. But that creates a problem. How can a God of absolute perfection live in the middle of a community of flawed and often rebellious people without condoning their sin and their evil? How can God do that? It's one of the big questions that the Bible's story seeks to answer. And the answer at this point is to do with animal sacrifice. The book of Leviticus talks about that. I'm not going to go through it, but chapters 4 and 16 of Leviticus talk about the sin offering, where somebody has done something that's made them guilty, that's going to separate them from God, and they're to bring an animal, and before they kill the animal to sacrifice it, they're to lay their hands on it, a deeply symbolic moment where they are transferring onto the head of the animal their own guilt for what they've done. And the animal then dies to take the punishment that they, the guilty one, deserves so that they can be forgiven. Again, it's only a very short step into the New Testament, where Jesus dies on the cross as the righteous one for us unrighteous ones, in order to bring us to God. One of the Jewish prophets, Isaiah, spoke ahead of time of this happening and spoke of the Lord's servant who would die and be punished for his people. And he said, all of us like sheep, we've gone astray, we've wandered off, we put ourselves in God's place. But the Lord has laid on him, on Jesus Christ, the iniquity, the bad stuff, the sin of us all. He died on the cross with our sins, with my sins, on his shoulders. He took the punishment so I didn't have to. He died so that I could live with him. Well, by this stage, the people are still a nomadic people with no home of their own, even though they've got God living among them. But God had promised them a land for themselves. And the book of Joshua tells us the story of how they move into that land, freed from slavery, free to live as the people of God in the lands. Freedom is a very big deal for human beings. And yes, this was a long walk to freedom, but it is a great picture of the freedom that God still desires for us. The freedom that can come to us when we put our trust in Jesus Christ. So just to finish, please watch the screen and see Matt's story of how that freedom has transformed him.
I was at university, I was steeped in sort of lad culture, but with that just came more and more misery. My name's Matt, and this is my story. I've always been in the church, really, and then I walked away from the Lord at about 17. I finished college, and then I went to university, and I just went out all the time, and that's when I really stepped away from the Lord, and I really just went out and getting drunk, and I was getting into more and more trouble. I got into a fight at university, and I damaged the guy quite badly. And I went to the police station, and I remember just before I went in, I was praying. I said, Lord, if you get me out of this, I'll change my life. I'll change my life. And I didn't. Basically, I went straight back to it once I got out. I quit university after 2 years, and then I came back home and I got into another fight with some bouncers. I got arrested. But I remember again, I prayed just before that. I said, Lord, if you get me out of this, I'll change. And I was put into the back of a police car, and my mates were put into another one. They drove my mates to the police station and drove me over to Tesco car park and just opened the door and said, right, you can go. When I came home from university, I realised that I needed to work really hard if I wanted to be successful, and that's what I did, just got my head down. Yeah, but it was coming to a point where I'd worked my way up to be able to take over my own business. Just a normal day, and my mate rang me, we were about to take it over in a week's time. He said, this is my partner, he said, can I ring you? I'm having second thoughts, can we have a chat? Yeah, he just says, I'm starting having all these second thoughts, I don't know if I want to do it, I don't know if I want to do this in my life, and I'm thinking, okay, this is not good for me. And then he says, I'm having all these questions as well about Jesus. And I was like, what? And he just starts asking me all these questions. And yeah, right there, I felt the Lord spoke to me and he said, that I'll give you the answers if you trust me. And that sort of just changed everything then. Suddenly this Jesus that I'd heard about had suddenly become speaking to me. And I was like, what's going on here? I went back to work on my own and I was just thinking about what had just happened, thinking about my life. And I remember I knew Billy Graham, and I put a Billy Graham sermon on YouTube, and he spoke about from Joshua 24, you've got to make a choice for your life. Whom this day do you serve? And right then and there I said, Lord, I want to change, I want to choose you, but I can't. From the past I try and change my behaviour, but it just doesn't work. I need you to come in and do it. And that's the first time I really surrendered, and he came in and changed me, and that was 6 years ago. It says, those who have sinned much love much, and it's very true for me. To know that I stand right now forgiven of my sins is amazing. And I can live with a real freedom. Jesus doesn't just make a difference to your life, he transforms your life.